The blizzard came down like God's fist. Through the white wall of swirling snow, Matthew Hayes saw the dark shape collapse. He'd been riding fence line, checking posts before the storm buried everything in this corner of Montana territory. February 1885. The wind howled like wounded wolves, tearing at his worn cavalry coat, freezing the breath in his lungs. Temperature dropping fast. Sky bruised purple-gray, pressing down on the valley like a lid on a pot ready to boil over. A man caught in this would freeze before he could count to 500. Matthew had almost missed the figure, a dark smudge against endless white. Someone was out there. He didn't hesitate. Couldn't. Hesitation meant death in Montana winters. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Matthew urged Thunder forward into the white chaos, every instinct screaming to turn back toward shelter. But hesitation meant death in Montana winters, and someone was dying out there in the snow. The wind cut through his worn cavalry coat like knives, ice crusting his beard, each breath burning his lungs as the temperature plummeted toward 20 below. His right leg ached where the Confederate Millionaire ball had shattered bone at Antietam. Old wounds always singing in cold weather. A reminder of debts paid in blood and battles that never quite ended. He reached the fallen figure in seconds that felt like hours, dismounted despite the scream of pain from his bad leg, and pulled her up dead weight. But he felt shallow breathing against his frozen hands. A woman, face down in the snow, one arm stretched out like she'd been reaching for something that wasn't there. Fine leather coat soaked through, dark hair frozen to her neck. Too fine a coat for these parts. City clothes, Eastern clothes, the kind of quality that spoke of wealth he'd never known even before the war, took everything. "Wasn't your day to die, ma'am?" he muttered through numb lips, hefting her across Thunder's saddle with strength born of desperation and 15 years of hard living. The storm swallowed them whole as he turned the horse toward home, visibility zero, navigating by instinct and faith, counting fence posts he couldn't see, trusting Thunder to find the way while his fingers went numb inside leather gloves and his mind flashed back to Gettysburg in July 1863, dragging Lieutenant Collins through artillery fire after both his legs were taken by a cannonball. Same burning in his lungs then, same certainty that every step could be his last, but he'd gotten Collins to the field hospital and the man had lived, gone home to his wife in Ohio, and some instincts never left you, some debts never got paid in full. The cabin appeared suddenly through the whiteness, a dark square against the endless white chaos, stone foundation and timber walls he'd built himself after the bank took his family farm, small but solid. It would hold against anything the Montana sky could throw down. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, laid her near the stone fireplace where her lips were blue and shivering violent, body fighting hypothermia and losing. Matthew worked fast despite his shaking hands, built the fire high, the kindling catching then the split pine, flames licking upward and casting orange light across rough timber walls. He stripped her wet coat, her boots, respectful but desperate, and the coat was worth more than everything he owned, fine European wool lined with fox fur. Brass buttons with some family crest he didn't recognize. Her dress underneath equally fine, deep blue silk with intricate stitching. A dress for society parlors, not Montana wilderness. He wrapped her in his only wool blanket, the one his mother had woven before the war, before everything changed, before the farm was lost and his parents died within months of each other, broken by loss and shame. The woman didn't wake, just shivered and shivered while Matthew sat back against the wall, exhausted, watching her breathe, watching the storm scream outside while inside the fire caught and held. She was alive. That was enough for now. This land didn't forgive hesitation. You moved or you died. Matthew had moved. Now all he could do was wait and tend the fire and hope the morning would find her still breathing. She woke to firelight and the smell of coffee, bitter and strong and real, her eyes opening slowly, disoriented, her body aching like she'd been trampled by horses. The room swam into focus, one room, rough-hewn timber, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding tin plates and not much else, a fireplace crackling warmly, and a man sitting across from her watching quietly with eyes that had seen too much. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and graveled like stones tumbling downstream. "Steady. You had a close call." She tried to sit up and pain shot through her ribs, gasped, and the man stood, poured coffee from a dented pot, offered her a tin cup. "Ain't much, but it's warm." She took it with trembling hands, the heat feeling like life returning. Sipped it terrible. Coffee, burnt black, strong enough to strip paint, but it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. "Where am I?" Her voice came out raspy. "My place, about 3 miles from Timberline, storm still going." He gestured to the window where white fury continued unabated. "Found you near my fence line. Been out nearly a day." "A day?" Her mind spun. He nodded, didn't push, placed a plate with beans and salt pork on the table, simple food, took half and left half for her. "Matthew Hayes," he said finally. "You got a name?" She hesitated because if she told him who she really was, everything would change. It always did. "Elizabeth," she said finally, just that, nothing more. He nodded, accepting what she offered without demanding more, and she noticed then the empty shelves, the patched roof, the worn Bible with no spine sitting by the narrow bed he was sharing what little he had. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You'd have done the same." Matthew looked away, uncomfortable with gratitude, but Elizabeth wasn't sure that was true. She'd never been tested like that. They ate in silence, not awkward but companionable, like two people who'd survived something together, and the storm kept on through the night. Matthew banked the fire, showed her how to keep it steady without wasting wood, and she noticed his shirt torn at the shoulder, patched badly. "Let me," she said, reaching for her saddlebag that he'd rescued along with her. Found thread and needle, small things she carried, tools from a life he knew nothing about. She mended the tear while he tended the fire. Neither spoke, didn't need to, and when she finished, she handed it back, their fingers touching just for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "You saved my life," Elizabeth replied. And he looked at her then, really looked, with one blue eye and one slightly clouded from an old injury. "I don't know if I would have stopped for a stranger in that storm," she added softly, and something passed between them. An SBW, understanding neither could name. On the rough shelf beside his bed, she noticed something unexpected the next morning: books. Not many, but real books with worn spines and pages soft from reading. Shakespeare, Whitman, a collection of Greek philosophy, Marcus Aurelius. "You read," she said, surprised, and immediately regretted the assumption in her voice. "Used to teach," Matthew said quietly, stoking the morning fire. "Before the war, had plans for a schoolhouse on my family's land." "What happened?" Elizabeth asked, then wondered if she'd overstepped. Matthew was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "War happened. Came back to find everything changed. Parents couldn't hold the farm. Bank foreclosed in '80. They died that winter, both of them, 1 month apart." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Elizabeth heard the weight beneath it, the kind of loss that never quite healed. "The books are all I kept from the old house." They talked then, carefully at first, then with growing ease, about Hamlet's indecision, about Whitman's celebration of the common man, about whether Marcus Aurelius truly practiced what he preached. Matthew spoke with the precision of an educated man who'd been forced into manual labor but never lost his mind, and Elizabeth found herself responding with genuine thoughts rather than the practiced charms she used in society parlors. "You've read more than most men I know," Matthew observed. "Father believed education was wasted on women, but Mother disagreed. She taught me secretly, hired tutors who would come at odd hours." Elizabeth caught herself revealing too much, but Matthew just nodded. "Your mother sounds like she had sense." The storm raged for 2 more days, and in that time Elizabeth learned more about Matthew Hayes than she'd learned about anyone in years of society functions: his service in the Union cavalry, the injury that still pained him, his dreams of rebuilding what was lost, his quiet acceptance of a hard life, his refusal to give in to bitterness despite having every reason. She told him carefully edited versions of her own life. Enough truth to feel honest, but nothing that would reveal her as Elizabeth Prescott, daughter of the territory's most powerful banker, the very bank that had taken his family's farm. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke, pale light filtering through the single window, the wind finally quiet. Matthew opened the door to blinding white. Snow drifted 4 feet high against the cabin, but the sky was clearing, bright blue emerging from the gray. Storms passed, he said, and Elizabeth felt something sink in her chest. I should get back, she said, though the words felt wrong. Town will be worried. Matthew nodded, began preparing thunder, and Elizabeth gathered her things, the fine coat dry now, the silk dress brushed clean, the transformation from stranded woman back to whoever she really was beginning. She touched the gold locket at her throat, engraved with the Prescott family crest, worth more than this entire cabin, had hidden it throughout her stay. Wasn't ready even now to explain. Let me pay you, she said as Matthew brought thunder around. For your trouble, for the food, the shelter. No payment needed, Matthew said firmly. Simple decency requires no debt. But you gave me everything you had, which is why payment would insult it. Matthew interrupted gently. You'd have done the same, you said so yourself. Elizabeth felt tears threatening, blinked them back. In her world, everything had a price. Every kindness expected return. But here was a man with nothing who'd saved her life, and refused compensation because to accept it would diminish the act. Then let me repay it somehow. Please, there must be something. You already did, Matthew gestured to his mended shirt. We're even. They weren't, not even close. But Elizabeth saw the pride in his bearing and understood that to push further would wound something essential. Matthew helped her onto Thunder, would ride with her to the edge of town, make sure she got back safe. They traveled in silence through the transformed landscape, everything buried and new, and Elizabeth memorized the profile of the man beside her, the quiet strength, the dignity that poverty couldn't touch. At the town's edge, where the first buildings became visible, she dismounted. Thank you, Matthew Hayes, she said formally. I won't forget what you did. Safe travels, Elizabeth, he replied, just her first name, still not knowing who she really was. And she watched him ride back toward his lonely cabin, back toward a life of hardship while she returned to a mansion with more rooms than she could count. And the injustice of it hit her like a physical blow. She walked into timberline as the sun climbed higher, melting the snow, revealing the town she'd grown up in but suddenly saw differently. And she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't leave things as they were, couldn't return to her old life, pretending these 3 days hadn't changed everything. Couldn't let Matthew Hayes remain in poverty while her family's wealth grew from the suffering of men exactly like him. The Prescott mansion rose 3 stories above Timberline's main street, white columns and imported marble declaring wealth that dwarfed every other building in the territory. And Elizabeth stood in the foyer feeling like a stranger in her own home. The contrast so jarring it made her physically ill. Crystal chandeliers where Matthew had a single oil lamp, Persian rugs where he had bare wooden floors, a dining table that could seat 20 where he had 2 rough chairs and shared his last tin of beans. Her father, Samuel Prescott, waited in his study. Silver hair perfectly groomed, suit pressed. Every inch the territorial banker who'd built an empire from careful investments and ruthless foreclosures, and his eyes narrowed when she entered. 3 days, Elizabeth, 3 days without word, the entire town searching. Do you have any idea the embarrassment, the gossip? She wanted to tell him about Matthew Hayes, about genuine kindness that expected nothing in return, about a man who'd saved her life with his last resources, while her father counted profits in a heated office. But instead she said, I was caught in the storm, found shelter. I'm fine now. The lie tasted bitter. That evening, society came calling women in silk gowns, whispering behind fans about Elizabeth's mysterious absence, men discussing railroad expansion and mineral rights, while servants poured French wine, and Elizabeth sat in her blue velvet chair feeling suffocated by the artifice of it all. The calculated friendships, the marriages arranged for advantage, the whole glittering system built on the backs of men like Matthew who worked themselves to death and lost everything anyway. She excused herself early, claiming fatigue, and locked herself in her bedroom where she pulled out the simple wool blanket Matthew had wrapped around her, still carrying the scent of wood smoke and honest labor, and she pressed it to her face and wept for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. The next morning, determined to do something, anything, to repay Matthew's kindness, Elizabeth went to her father's office in the Prescott banking building, told his secretary she needed to review charitable donation records, and was ushered into the vault where ledgers stretched back 20 years, careful accounting of every loan, every foreclosure, every property acquired when families couldn't pay. She searched for the Hayes name, thinking perhaps she could make an anonymous donation, help him somehow without injuring his pride, and her finger stopped on a ledger entry from 1,880. Hayes, James and Margaret Farm foreclosure, 160 acres Section Township. Loan default after poor harvest. Property seized November 15th. Resold December 3rd to Territorial Land Company for $800 profit. The room tilted. Matthew's family, Matthew's farm, taken by her father's bank 5 years ago, and she remembered Matthew's voice saying, "Parents couldn't hold the farm. Bank foreclosed in '80. They died that winter, both of them, 1 month apart, and now she knew which bank, whose signature was on the foreclosure notice, whose profit had been built on the Hayes family's destruction. She felt sick, physically sick. Stumbled out of the vault and barely made it to the alley before vomiting against the brick wall. Her family's wealth suddenly revealed as blood money, built on the suffering of people like Matthew's parents who'd worked the land for generations, only to lose everything when one bad harvest met an unforgiving loan. She was still leaning against the wall, trying to compose herself, when Thomas Sullivan found her father's business partner, ambitious and sharp-eyed, always watching for advantage. "Miss Prescott, are you unwell?" His concern was calculated. Everything about Sullivan was calculated, from his expensive suits to his practiced smile. "I'm fine," she managed. "Just reviewing some old records. It's disturbing to see how many families lost their properties." Sullivan's eyes gleamed with interest. "Business is often disturbing up close, but necessary for progress. In fact, I'm working on several acquisitions now that will consolidate our holdings in the valley. Small properties that aren't being used efficiently. The Hayes plot, for instance, just 3 miles out, barely supporting one man, could be combined with the Morrison Ranch to create a profitable cattle operation." Elizabeth's blood went cold. "The Hayes property? Small cabin, poor land. The owner is behind on territorial taxes. Shouldn't be difficult to acquire through the usual methods," Sullivan said casually, and Elizabeth heard the threat beneath the words. The usual methods meaning manipulation and legal maneuvering that squeezed out small holders who couldn't fight back. "Father knows about this? He's aware of the overall strategy. Consolidation is the future, Miss Prescott. Sentiment doesn't build railroads or bring civilization to the wilderness." Sullivan smiled, misreading her. "Interest. Perhaps you'd like to be involved in the business side. You've clearly been studying the ledgers. Your father always said you had a head for numbers." She wanted to spit in his face, wanted to scream that Matthew Hayes was worth 10 of Sullivan, that the cabin he dismissed so casually was home to more genuine decency than Sullivan would ever understand. But instead she forced a smile and said, "Very interesting. I'd like to learn more about these acquisitions. Perhaps you could show me the relevant documents." Sullivan practically glowed with self-satisfaction. Finally, the Prescott daughter showing interest in real business, and he promised to prepare a full briefing. Walked away, planning how to leverage her involvement, while Elizabeth stood in the alley plotting his destruction. 2 weeks later, Matthew came to town for supplies, and Elizabeth saw him from the window of Weber's General Store, saw him tie Thunder to the post, saw him walk with that slight limp toward the door, and her heart leaped and broke simultaneously because she hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't figured out how to bridge the impossible distance between the woman he'd saved and the heiress she actually was. She was standing with Catherine Morrison and her mother, discussing the upcoming territorial ball, wearing a green silk dress that cost more than Matthew earned in a year, and when he walked in and their eyes met, she watched understanding and betrayal cross his face in rapid succession. "Matthew," she said, stepping forward, but he'd already registered the scene. Elizabeth Prescott, daughter of Samuel Prescott, the same bank that had destroyed his family, and everything from the storm, the coffee, the mended shirt, all of it recast in a new and terrible light. "Miss Prescott," he said formally, coldly, his face a mask, and the 2 words created a chasm between them wider than any blizzard. "I didn't know," she started, but what could she say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? And Matthew was already turning away, completing his business with Weber in clipped sentences, leaving without looking back while Catherine whispered, "Wasn't that the Hayes boy? I heard his family lost their farm to your father's bank. Such unfortunate circumstances." and Elizabeth wanted to scream that he wasn't a boy but a man, a better man than anyone in this room. But instead she excused herself and went home and locked herself in her room like a child. She couldn't leave it like that, wouldn't. So the next day, Elizabeth rode out to Matthew's cabin despite knowing it was improper. Despite the gossip it would cause, despite everything her upbringing said about proper behavior and social boundaries. She brought books, new volumes of poetry she thought he'd like, a history of the Roman Empire, small offerings that felt inadequate but were all she could think to give. Matthew was repairing his fence when she arrived, looked up with that same cold expression. "You shouldn't be here." "I know, but I needed to explain." "Nothing to explain, Miss Prescott. You're who you are. I'm who I am. The storm's over. Best we both move on." His words were reasonable, but his eyes were wounded, and Elizabeth dismounted, walked toward him despite the fence between them. "I didn't know about the foreclosure. Not until last week. I found the records and Matthew. I'm so sorry. If I could change what happened." "Can't change the past," Matthew said flatly. "Your father did what bankers do. My parents couldn't pay. That's the end of it." "It's not the end," Elizabeth insisted. "Sullivan is planning to take your land now, the same way, and I won't let it happen." That got his attention, his cold mask cracking slightly. "Sullivan? He's targeting properties for consolidation, including yours. But I'm gathering evidence of his methods, fraud, manipulation, and when I have enough, I'm going to expose him." Matthew studied her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because what happened to your family was wrong. Because you saved my life when you had no reason to. Because—" She stopped, couldn't finish the sentence. "Because I'm falling in love with you" sounded insane after 2 weeks. Matthew's expression softened fractionally. "Town's already talking about you riding out here, going to make your life difficult. I don't care about the town. You should. You've got a position, a future. Don't throw it away on something that can't work." But he didn't send her away, and when she came back the next week with more books and an offer to help repair his roof, he accepted. And gradually, carefully, a bridge began to form between them, built on shared work and careful conversations about literature and justice, and what it meant to live with integrity in a world designed to reward its opposite. She told him about her mother, dead 10 years now, who'd believed in education and fairness, and he told her about teaching, about the school he'd dreamed of building before the war changed everything. They didn't speak about the foreclosure directly, but it hung between them, an acknowledged wound, and Elizabeth worked in secret with Judge Davidson, a retired Union officer who'd settled in Timberline and maintained his commitment to law over profit, showing him the ledgers, the patterns of Sullivan's acquisitions, the forged documents and manipulated tax claims. Davidson listened carefully, his old soldier's eyes hard with recognition of a different kind of battlefield. "This is dangerous, Miss Prescott. Men like Sullivan don't take kindly to exposure. And your father—" "My father chose profit over people," Elizabeth said firmly. "I'm choosing differently." Davidson nodded slowly. "Then we'll need ironclad evidence, everything documented, witnesses if possible. Enough to bring territorial charges that can't be dismissed or buried." They began the careful work of building a case, Elizabeth using her access to the bank's records, Davidson reaching out to other families who'd lost property under suspicious circumstances. And through it all, Elizabeth continued visiting Matthew, continued building something fragile and real despite the impossible circumstances, despite knowing that when the truth came out, it would destroy her father and possibly her along with him. But she'd made her choice in that cabin during the storm, had seen what real decency looked like, and she couldn't go back to the gilded ignorance of her old life no matter what it cost. The evidence accumulated like snow before an avalanche, 3 months of careful documentation revealing a pattern so extensive it took Elizabeth's breath away. 23 families over 7 years, properties targeted when owners faced temporary hardship, tax records mysteriously altered, foreclosure notices delivered with impossible deadlines, and always Thomas Sullivan's signature on the transfer documents, sometimes alongside her father's, sometimes alone when the corruption was too blatant for even Samuel Prescott's compromised conscience. Judge Davidson spread the papers across his dining table, his weathered hands sorting them into categories while his wife Sarah brought coffee and looked over his shoulder with growing horror. This isn't just unethical business practice, Davidson said quietly, his judge's mind cataloging the crimes. This is systematic fraud, forgery of territorial documents, bribery of county officials. We've got enough here to bring federal charges. Elizabeth felt the weight of what they'd uncovered. 23 families destroyed like the Hayes family, children scattered, dreams buried. Also, Sullivan could build his empire, and her father could maintain his position as the territory's most powerful banker. We need to move soon, she said. Sullivan's getting suspicious. He asked me last week why I was so interested in the Hayes property. I think he knows I'm investigating. Davidson nodded gravely. Then we go to the territorial marshal tomorrow. But Elizabeth, once we do this, there's no going back. Your father will be implicated. Your family's reputation destroyed. You'll lose everything you've known. I lost everything I believed in the moment I found those ledgers, Elizabeth replied. And she thought of Matthew in his poor cabin sharing his last food with a stranger. Thought of real integrity versus the hollow respectability her family had built on other people's suffering. And she knew which side of that divide she wanted to stand on. That evening she rode home through streets where everyone knew her name, knew her family's wealth, knew the Prescott mansion represented power and stability in a rough territory. And she felt like she was seeing it all for the first time, seeing how many small cabins surrounded her father's grand house, how many people bowed their heads when she passed, not from respect but from the knowledge that her family held their futures in ledgers and loan documents. She found Samuel in his study reviewing papers, always numbers, the machinery of wealth grinding forward regardless of human cost. Father, we need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. He looked up, registered something in her expression that made him set down his pen. About what happened with the Hayes family in 1880, about Thomas Sullivan's land acquisitions, about how we've built everything we have. Samuel's face went carefully neutral. That's business, Elizabeth, sometimes. Unfortunate but necessary. 23 families, she interrupted, pulling the evidence from her satchel and spreading it across his mahogany desk. 23 families over 7 years, forged documents, bribed officials, foreclosures executed with impossible deadlines. And your signature on half of them. The color drained from her father's face as he looked at the papers. And Elizabeth watched him age. 10 years. In 10 seconds. Watched the careful justifications he'd built over years crumble as the pattern became undeniable. Sullivan assured me these were legitimate business transactions. You knew, Elizabeth said, not accusing but stating fact. Maybe you didn't know every detail, but you knew the methods weren't honest. You knew we were taking advantage of people's hardship, and you let it happen because it was profitable. Samuel stood, paced to the window, and for a long moment said nothing, just stared out at the town he'd helped build and the empire he'd created. Your mother would be ashamed, he said finally, his voice breaking. She always said there were lines a man shouldn't cross, that wealth without honor was no legacy at all. And I told her she didn't understand business, didn't understand what it took to survive in this territory, but she understood better than I did. The admission hung between them, father and daughter, and Elizabeth felt tears on her cheeks. It's not too late, she said. Judge Davidson is taking this evidence to the territorial marshal tomorrow. Sullivan will be arrested, but you could cooperate, make restitution, try to right the wrongs even if we can't undo them all. And if I don't? Samuel asked quietly. Then you'll be arrested alongside him, Elizabeth said, and the words hurt but she meant them. I love you, Father, but I won't protect you from the consequences of your choices. Not when families like the Hayes lost everything because of those choices. Samuel looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw something he'd missed in his pursuit of profit strength, moral clarity, the kind of integrity he'd compromised away over years of small justifications and ethical shortcuts. Tell me about the Hayes boy, he said finally. The one you've been visiting, the one everyone's talking about. Elizabeth told him. About the blizzard, about Matthew's cabin and his books and his refusal to accept payment for simple decency, about discovering the foreclosure and understanding what her family's wealth had cost, about falling in love with a man who had nothing but lived with more honor than anyone in her social circle. Samuel listened, and when she finished, he said, I'll cooperate with Davidson. Full restitution for every family we wronged, whatever it takes. The relief nearly buckled her knees. But there was no time to savor it because that night Sullivan came to the Prescott mansion, came through the servant's entrance like a thief, and Elizabeth heard raised voices from her father's study, crept close enough to hear Sullivan's threats. "You'll destroy everything we've built, Samuel. For what? To satisfy your daughter's ridiculous conscience. She's been seeing that Hayes beggar, everyone knows it. She's compromised, irrational. She's the only one of us seeing clearly," Samuel replied, and Elizabeth's heart swelled hearing her father's defense. "I'm testifying, Thomas. It's over." Sullivan's voice went cold. "Then I'll make sure the Hayes property is transferred before any investigation can stop it. I'll ruin your daughter's reputation so thoroughly she'll never show her face in society again. And I'll see to it that Hayes loses not just his current land but any chance of reclaiming his family's farm. You'll have nothing, Samuel. Nothing but moral satisfaction and bankruptcy." Elizabeth burst into the room. "You won't touch Matthew's land. You won't touch anything else, because tomorrow morning Judge Davidson is presenting evidence to the territorial marshal, and you'll be in custody before you can forge another document." Sullivan's face twisted with rage and calculation, saw her standing there with her father behind her, and made his choice. He lunged for the evidence she was holding, tried to grab the papers and destroy them, but Samuel moved faster than Elizabeth would have thought possible for a man his age, caught Sullivan's arm, and the two men struggled while Elizabeth ran for help. By the time the town marshal arrived, alerted by the shouting, Sullivan was cornered and desperate, and in his desperation, he made his fatal mistake, tried to bribe the marshal with promises of wealth and influence, not knowing the marshal was Davidson's nephew and had already been briefed on the investigation. The arrest happened that night instead of the next morning. Sullivan dragged from the Prescott mansion in handcuffs while society watched and whispered, and by dawn the whole territory knew that Thomas Sullivan faced federal charges of fraud and corruption. The trial came 6 weeks later in the territorial courthouse, the room packed with families Sullivan had destroyed and society figures who'd benefited from his schemes, and Elizabeth sat in the witness box with her hands folded in her lap and told the truth about finding the ledgers, about Sullivan's threats, about the systematic targeting of vulnerable properties. Matthew testified about his family's farm, about his parents' deaths, about losing everything to a system designed to extract wealth from those least able to defend themselves, and his quiet dignity moved the entire courtroom. But the moment that broke the trial open was when Samuel Prescott took the stand, dressed simply rather than in his usual expensive suits, and confessed his complicity, admitted he'd known Sullivan's methods were corrupt and had profited anyway, and offered full restitution to every family wronged by their business practices. The prosecutor was shocked. They'd expected Prescott to deflect blame, not accept responsibility, but Samuel looked at his daughter in the gallery and said, "I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to make it right. Starting now." The verdict came quickly. Sullivan convicted on 17 counts of fraud, 3 counts of forgery, and multiple counts of bribery, sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison, with his entire fortune seized for restitution. Samuel Prescott was given immunity for his testimony and cooperation, but the cost was still enormous. The Prescott banking empire dismantled, the mansion sold to cover restitution payments, Samuel himself moving to a modest house and working to rebuild not his fortune but his character. The restitution process took months, Judge Davidson overseeing the complex work of identifying wronged families and calculating fair compensation. And when Matthew's name came up on the list, Samuel personally delivered the documents restoring the Hayes family farm, 20 acres his grandfather had cleared, where his parents were buried, where he'd dreamed of building a school before the war changed everything. Matthew stood on the land in early April, spring sun warming his face, holding the deed that proved it was his again, and Elizabeth rode up to find him kneeling in the dirt, tears running down his weathered face. She dismounted, sat beside him, said nothing because no words were adequate for a moment like this, just sat with him while he held earth that was finally, legally, irrevocably his. When he could speak, Matthew said, "Your father gave up everything for this." "He gave up wealth," Elizabeth corrected. "But he gained something more important. Self-respect, the possibility of redemption. Those things matter more than money." Matthew looked at her. This woman who'd walked away from society and scandal to teach in the small schoolhouse 3 days a week and help Davidson with court documentation the rest. Who'd chosen principle over comfort and never once regretted it. "Town's still talking," he said. "Let them talk," Elizabeth replied, the same thing she'd said months ago. "They matter less each day." They walked together to the old farmhouse, weathered but solid. Matthew pointing out where he'd repair the porch, where he'd plant apple trees come fall, where the school might be built someday when resources allowed. "I'm heading to Helena next week," he said finally, gruffly uncertain. "Need supplies, seed, tools, lumber for repairs, long journey alone." He paused, looked at her directly. "Thought maybe you might want to come along, if you've no other obligations." The invitation hung between them. Not quite a declaration, but more than casual. A door opened that both could choose to walk through. "Town that size, people don't know your history," Matthew continued, focusing on the distant mountains. "Don't care about names or fortunes lost. Just two people traveling together. Nothing more complicated than that." Elizabeth smiled, genuine and full, reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the porch railing. "I'd like that very much." They sat as the afternoon sun warmed the old porch, planning practical things, what supplies were needed, how long the journey would take, where they might stay, but beneath the practical conversation ran something deeper. An acknowledgement that they'd chosen each other not through wealth or circumstance, but through shared principles and quiet courage. Behind them stood a house waiting to become a home again. Before them stretched fields ready for planting. And between them something fragile and strong taking root like the first shoots of wheat pushing through Montana soil after winter's sleep. In the distance, the mountains stood silent witness, unchanged by human schemes or seasons, having seen empires rise and fall, fortunes made and lost, love found in unlikely circumstances, seeing it all again now with two figures on an old porch, planning not an empire but a life, simple, honest, theirs. Some storms came suddenly, transforming landscapes overnight. Others worked slowly.